Here we are, Kayla, going for zero waste in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, and we are very excited for that. So we will start off with just a background on zero waste. I think it's helpful to kind of frame the rest of the conversation since Pressure Crusades grant isn't pertained particularly to just zero waste, but they focus on recycling. But zero waste is kind of a broader concept about reducing overall waste in all of our systems. And so there's a Zero Waste International Alliance that formed in the early 2000s, and they came up with this definition for what zero waste is. And so I won't read it. You can kind of see the bolded sections of it, what we're trying to get at when we talk about zero waste. So emulating sustainable natural cycles is one of them. We don't consider waste in zero waste, or sorry, we don't consider resources as waste. We consider them resources to be used in different cycles or streams. Zero waste also means that we are designing and managing products and processes to avoid all sorts of toxicity of waste and not to burn or bury them, because those are not considered zero waste solutions. And so further in the conversation, this is a diagram from the ZWIA board from 2013. And so reading the triangle from top to bottom, this is another way of looking at zero waste hierarchy. And so what we're trying to focus on doing when we talk about zero waste and approaching it, especially from an events perspective, is we're looking to reduce and conserve materials as much as possible. And that should be our first strategy for when we decide that we're implementing zero waste. And then reuse is a little bit lower on the hierarchy. And then recycling and composting is actually towards the bottom of this hierarchy. Although it's important to capture those materials, we're already living in a system that produces too much. And so with a wasteful society that we live in, we're looking to reduce and conserve those materials from the get-go. And another diagram here is the EPA's food recovery hierarchy. And so again, we're looking at this from top to bottom for solutions to zero waste. And so similarly to the zero waste hierarchy, source reduction is one of the most important things that we want to look to when we begin this journey of implementing zero waste. And then again, feeding hungry people and then animals are higher up on food waste hierarchy. And then using the organic material for industrial uses. And then again, composting is very low on this hierarchy, but with events, this is where we can focus kind of on like the physical component of capturing this material and making sure that it's not just going to a landfill, but rather used as feedstock for creating more nutritious soil. And so zero waste, we have 4 examples of what it isn't. And these are kind of common myths, so to say, about what zero waste might seem to be to some people. But from our perspective, achieving zero waste isn't just recycling 100% of the waste you generate, because we're looking again towards the source reduction, towards and remembering about those hierarchies. And so zero waste also does not include incineration or waste to energy. That's what WTE stands for. Those are not solutions for a zero waste system, because that creates toxic material or toxic pollutants into the air by burning trash or recycling, or methane in the case of organic materials. And so kind of reiterating that point, zero waste to landfill is not zero waste. And when we say that, we're reiterating that point that even if you're recycling 100% of the material, that's great, but there's always something more that you can do to reduce the amount of material you're recycling, and considering reusable options such as like glass containers or jars for for drinks, instead of like plastic recyclable content cups or something like that. And so I want to pose a question to you, I guess, Kayla, or April. If zero waste is not waste management, then do you have any ideas as to what we would say zero waste is?
I have an idea. Kayla, do you?
Sure, go ahead, April.
I would say that it's waste prevention.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I like that. It's looking in the right direction. Kayla, anything?
I think it would be, just kind of closing the loop on waste from, like you were talking about the source all the way down to what it's being used for, and then how are we disposing of it. So I think thinking more about it maybe as a cycle and not just as, recycling or composting.
Yeah.
I think another would be just resource preservation or conservation.
Yep, you guys are nailing it. So the answer that I have is zero waste is sustainable resource management. And so you've got the right idea that when we are discussing zero waste, we're not talking about waste really, we're talking about resources that are just not being utilized or kept in the loops, as like plastics or organics, that these materials have further uses beyond just like a plastic cup or anything like that. So 5 components of a zero waste system, and so these 5 points here are all kind of the like essentials that you need in order to maintain like zero waste, especially in the context of doing events. Events definitely fall into needing support from policy, certain programs within your organization, having the manufacturing and design processes in mind that embrace circularity and design for reuse and recovery, and not just the landfill. And then also the resource recovery infrastructure. So landfills and incinerators are or can be rendered obsolete by recovering most of our discards through reuse, composting, and recycling, if those recovery infrastructure or systems exist. And then also empowered communities is another really important like piece of the puzzle to zero waste or practicing zero waste. If you don't have the back of your community or community members behind you, then it's likely that zero waste won't be able to thrive. But it seems like with Sustainable Wheat Ridge that you all have a lot of effort going on in the city, and that people are excited about what you're doing, which is great. And so switching a little bit towards events specifically, this slide is a visualization for EcoCycle's history here in the Front Range of working zero waste events. And so a big part of our department is working zero waste events and servicing and hauling material. And so I know, Kayla, that we talked in the beginning of, I think, February or March about working Carnation Festival with you all before it got canceled. And so all of these little circles that you see on the map are events that we've worked. And so we've interacted with almost 1.3 million people. I think this page I need to update to 2019, but we've engaged with almost yeah, I think 1.3 million people, and we've been able to really educate a number of people through all of the events that we've serviced, and so this is just a glimpse of that. And something else to note, another important number, I guess, is this 81% diversion rate. And this is something that EcoCycle is proud of. And this is the rate, if you're not familiar, is how much material is being diverted out of the landfill by recycling and composting. And so 81% of the material was recovered, and those materials either went to recycling or composting facilities. And so again, similar to the 5 components of a zero waste system, we have these essentials for zero waste event practice. And so these are specific for zero waste events. And so we'll start with the commitment section, since this is a very important piece of zero waste events, is having that buy-in from the get-go from all stakeholders, be it your city or city council, or the organization that you're working through. You really need to have the support of your organization behind you in order to maintain the zero waste kind of practice into your events. And so a way to kind of instate that into your organization is by building a green team. And so a green team should ideally include supervisors for like planning and overall logistics of your events, but then also having a green team member be in charge of vendors, exhibitors, and any sponsors at your event. And then a third important green team member would be someone who engages with and organizes the staff and volunteers. And so they will be the one in charge of training volunteers or other staff members before the event or on the day of the event, to make sure that volunteers who are coming to your event know what materials are recyclable, what materials are compostable, and pretty much where all of your materials will be going that day, and be able to troubleshoot or be able to support any volunteers who might not know where a certain discard goes. And then planning and engagement, these things I'll touch on further throughout this, but it's definitely important to have your internal staff be on board with zero waste, and then use your staff to engage with vendors and volunteers and guests. And as we've been working together, Kayla, the equipment and signage is another key component, and that's really what most patrons or guests at events are going to engage with, is seeing the signage on, or the stickers on the bins, or seeing the flags at your events and knowing that they are a part of this zero waste effort. And that helps people kind of, I don't know, have a sort of responsibility for their trash or recycling, and know that there's a conceded effort at your event to make sure that as little material is going to landfill as possible. And then training, sorting guides, like the equipment, or sorry, like the signage for your X-frames are an important piece of having your volunteers be on the same page about where materials are going, and being able to troubleshoot smaller items or materials that might not be as common, and knowing and understanding where those materials should be going in one of your 3 waste streams. And then another part of the training is also having the goalies. And so that's what we call any volunteers who are stationed at a zero waste station, is they're helping achieve the goal of zero waste. And so they're the ones that are interacting with customer or patrons of the event, and helping, help have those event goers understand, like, oh, my food can go into the compost. Like, I didn't know that or this material could go into the compost, or you know, having that educational component is really important, so that your community sees zero waste more commonly in your city. And so zero waste events, you can really help practice for what your long-term goals for the city is having recycling and composting. And I know that Sustainable Wheat Ridge is working on that for residential homes. And then another note is the communication. And so whenever you're planning for a zero waste event, it's important, kind of like the flags or other signage, to communicate that your intent is to have this be a zero waste event, and make sure that people coming to the event know that there is this effort to be conscious about where the materials are being discarded and how. And so you can do that through social media, whatever channels that may be, or at your staff meetings with Sustainable Wheat Ridge, etc. And so this is a timeline that EcoCycle offers. The way to read this is kind of from the top left of the chart towards the bottom right. And so we usually allow for about 3 months or 90 days to prepare for a typical zero waste event, depending on how much practice an organization or city or community might have with zero waste. Depends on that kind of start date. I won't go through this in too much detail since there's a lot of information here, but you can see that including in the budget the effort for zero waste and making sure you have all of the hauling kind of set up and staff available, and then towards into planning, having making sure that you have shifts covered and that you have times for training any volunteers and or your own staff about zero waste and sorting guidelines. And then into vendors, a few months before your event, ideally you'll be sending out the vendor agreement. And I don't think that I have shared that with you, but I will after this call. And I will also share examples during this slide about what a vendor agreement is, but it's essentially a pledge or an agreement that your vendors make prior to the event, so that they know that they're taking part in this effort and that they are compliant with any sort of composting or recycling guidelines with their materials that they may be bringing to your event. And then finally, after step 5, you can see the recap and the diversion report, and then obviously thanking all stakeholders and volunteers and staff for their participation in zero waste. And so going into the actual event operations and schedule, it's important to have a map and schedule, obviously, for any event, so that you can be able to provide either event goers or your own volunteers with the knowledge of where zero waste stations might be or where bathrooms are, etc. But then, yeah, also for where the equipment is and where they'll be stationed in reference to either food trucks or any sort of exhibitor that is at the event. And so I mentioned earlier the staffing roles and responsibilities. These 3 leads are what form the green team. And so the green team lead would be someone who's in charge of the overall logistics for the event. Volunteer lead would be leading any volunteers that have signed up at the event. And then the vendor lead is the one who helps manage front and back of house waste for vendors and checking that their vendor agreement is in line with the material that they've brought to the event that day. And I'm not sure how you're kind of pulling volunteers from the community, but Our strategy at EcoCycle is using sign-up Genius, which you may be familiar with, and shooting that through any sort of social media channels or networks that we have wherever an event may be taking place, to kind of see if we can get community members involved at zero waste events, because it helps them kind of engage with zero waste at large in their community.
Right now, we are reaching out to the committee, and then kind of based on what the event is, if it's in collaboration with the city, then we're reaching out to city employees, starting with Parks and Rec, and then kind of expanding from there. And if it's a local works event, we're reaching out to the local works board, and then the local works organization also has a list of volunteers. So I think, you know, depending on who we're collaborating with for the event and the size of the event, we kind of have different pools of potential volunteers.
Great. That's awesome. Keep at it. And then the final piece here for planning and engagement is what I just mentioned with the vendors, is the zero waste pledge, or we also call it a vendor agreement. And those help enforce vendors who are coming to your event be compliant with any zero waste kind of efforts that you have in place. And so since you're doing composting, we usually recommend having vendors provide compostable plates or boats or any utensils, things like that, since plastic plastic food contaminated materials are very difficult to recycle and are not recyclable unless they are cleaned of any liquid and food residue left on them, which I think you have said that you've got compostable material for next Friday's event, which is great. And then the F&B vendor list is food and beverage vendor list, and making sure that you have contacts for all of your vendors, and then again, distributing that zero waste pledge or vendor agreement to them multiple weeks in advance of events. Typically, I know COVID has made things very difficult in terms of planning and solidifying dates for events. So this may look a little different in COVID times now. And then, so what I was just saying, I guess, was about resources for sustainable sourcing. And so these are a list of either manufacturers or distributors of compostable materials. And so we also want to make sure or emphasize that biodegradable does not mean something is compostable, which is why we clarify exactly what is and is not locally either recyclable or compostable with your stickers, and then also at the event itself to help event goers understand kind of the life cycle of this material, where it's going after the event, etc. And so here I've compiled a list of composting recycling services, and I know that the city of Wheat Ridge doesn't have a single hauler, and so I listed Republican Waste Management, and I know Alpine also services the Denver area. But I know also that you are using scraps for at least your city hall building for composting services, but I also found Rocky Mountain Composting and an organization in Arvada called Sustainability Recycling, who I think in the near future is offering either composting drop-off or pickup, which is really cool. And then a visual for what on the right side of the screen for what Scraps takes and accepts as compostable materials, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so this is an example of guidelines from a previous project from Missoula, Montana. And so the city has partnered with EcoCycle to help create their local guidelines for compost, recycling, and landfill. And these were just one example of those. And then we have your design for the stickers, which I'm hoping we get printed very soon so that you can use them for the number of events that you have scheduled in August. And so these will be your main sort of means of communicating to either volunteers and or the vendors about accepted materials for composting and recycling. And so we have, and especially when you're giving the training to volunteers, or when you show them this recording, we'll want to make sure that the recycling and composting guidelines, that these are clearly, like talked about. And so bottles, cans, cartons, plastic clamshells, and then cardboard paper and paper products, and then obviously aluminum foil as well, are all the accepted recyclable materials in Wheat Ridge. And then through scraps, we are obviously collecting all food scraps, and then BPI only, or BPI certified compostable materials only, whether it be plates, containers, utensils, or the hot and cold beverage cups, which are listed, or an example of which is shown in these guides. And then paper products that are not plastic coated. So napkins and paper towels are definitely good to throw in the compost. And then it's also important to note and describe the no categories surrounding each of the stickers. And so these are materials that we definitely want to keep out of landfill, keep out of the recycling. And so for the recycling container, we definitely don't want food or liquids that contaminates the material, clean material that is going to get sorted at your local recycling center. Plastic bags and straws, you definitely don't want in recycling, but then for compost, no plastic coated materials at all. They must be this BPI certified compostable. And they always have either the logo for BPI on them, printed on them, or they, like these products, these eco products, cups, say, I think compostable or certified compostable in that green stripe. And so
I have a quick question. So what about not the plastic coated, like I see the little pizza box, but for say the cardboard pizza box that normally would be composted, if it's not plastic coated, I guess it likely doesn't have the BPI compostable on it.
Right. Yeah. So pizza boxes that have any sort of grease residue on them, or a large amount of any sort of stickiness or cheese or whatever, you'll definitely want to put into the compost.
Yes, I was just thinking about, and I'm not sure, Kayla, are these going to be, where's the signage going to be specifically?
So these are located on the X frames. So the zero waste
on the X
stations.
frames. Okay.
Yeah. So
I was just thinking that a potential would be, we have like no, but it could be like if you have recycling. Well, I guess the X frames are all next to each other. I know it's like a set of 3. I just was thinking like a sign that's like, if it's dirty, then it can be, if it's like dirty paper, it could be compost, but someone's gonna be managing it. And I think this is probably the easiest. I just was thinking if there's this communication ahead of time, it would be good to have things like this maybe posted on our site before an event or on the event page so that people know that it's something to be thinking about ahead of time.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I can definitely make a note to, include your first point in the training for our volunteers that we would have in an event. That's a great point about the, if there's food on the paper, then it becomes compost and not recyclable. And then also I think, you know, if it's a local works event or whatever the partner organization is, I think, yes, definitely we can be advertising with these graphics, I think ahead of time on their social media or on the event website.
And I was going to add to that, it would be great if we had similar graphics that are, you know, things for people to prepare before they come, like bring your own drinking vessel. Like hopefully we'll be partnering with Denver Water or others to have a water station. Bring your own, like I travel with my own bamboo cutlery, which my family thinks is hilarious. But I travel with that everywhere. I have my own napkin with me. I always have my own water cup, but I usually also have some kind of device that I could use for like a plate or something. And so it would be cool if we had some kind of similar looking where it's like, here's the 4 different things and kind of what the no is, or not the no, that would be the positive of like, you know, plan ahead, bring your whatever, like you can, it'd just be kind of nice to advertise that along with these on websites to prepare people.
Yeah, a lot of great points. I just wanted to add, if I could, that these stickers on the bins are designed to kind of provide the baseline for sorting at the bins and providing, you know, supporting the education that the goalies are going to be in charge of. And so they're you know, they try to be as comprehensive as possible, but there's limited real estate. And so it's more about, you know, providing that baseline, and then the trained goalies, you know, it's up to them to provide that additional education, answer questions. You know, there's a lot of if-thens, like, you know, what Kayla mentioned. You know, likewise, if you have foil, you know, foil tray that has lots of lasagna left on it, you know, you may be able to dump that lasagna into the compost bin, but it may be caked on so much that you can't clean it. In that case, unfortunately, you get rid of as much food as possible, and then you're going to have to landfill that foil. So there's, you know, beyond this, there's definitely a lot of kind of insider knowledge that the trained staff can provide.
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas. April, I'm proud of you and supporting you in your reusable cutlery and bowls and cups and stuff. I definitely think that's a great idea for you all to provide, you know, prior to your event or on the event page itself for, hey, you know, we are doing compost and recycling, but if you want to go the extra mile, then yeah, bring your own beverage cup or bring your own cutlery or anything like that. Given that it's safe to do and is, you know, accepted by the event organizers or whatever. And then I didn't touch on the trash sticker, but it's fairly self-explanatory. It's the catch-all for the rest of the material that is not listed either in the recycling or the composting sticker. So it includes styrofoam, plastic coated paper plates and cups, which a lot of people think are either compostable when they see like a plate or bowl in this sticker. They're like, hey, but my cup or plate, you know, it looks just like that one, but you have to make sure that the plate itself does not have that plastic resin or wax resin on it. And then the big no's for trash are obviously food, because you are able to compost. You want to make sure that no food is getting into the landfill. And then again, with recyclables, we are definitely wanting to make sure that all glass and aluminum and cartons, bottles, cans, etc. are making their way to the recycling container and not the landfill. And so continuing the conversation about the equipment and signage, these are examples. So April, the top and bottom photos are what the zero waste station will look like all set up. And so where you see the words, it's very small, but where you see recyclables, compostables, and trash only, that's where these 3 stickers would be placed. So blue would correspond to blue, or blue would correspond to the recycling, and then the green for the compost and landfill sticker to the trash. And so again, what Bill emphasized is that it's not going to encase like all of the possibilities for material and conditions of material, which is why it's recommended that you have a goalie there to help any sort of event goers problem solve their waste. And so this setup on the left side of the page is like a 2-minute video from Clearstream Recycling, who is the manufacturer of these Clearstreams, and it has a video about how to set up the X-frames properly, how to place the bag inside of the frame, and then how to remove the bag when it's full of material. And so I definitely recommend using that link and video either at your training, whether it's happening virtually or having volunteers before an event. Make sure they know how to remove bags or open stations. And then the next couple of slides, I'm going to have just a few examples of site maps for events. And so again, with the movies on the ridge, I know that you've mentioned that you only, I think, either have one or just a few vendors or food trucks coming to the event. And so a site map may not be as important, but it's definitely something that you want to make sure that either your staff and also the volunteers have an understanding of the grounds of your event. And so knowing where either if there's porta potties on site or bathrooms in buildings, and knowing where to direct folks to those. But then also knowing where the dumpsters are on site, if they're on site, kind of where the material from the stations are going once bags are full, so that whether it's on the volunteers or if someone on the green team is helping lead the movement of the material once it's been bagged to a dumpster, kind of knowing that logistics flow is definitely really important. And so in this diagram, this is from Civic Center Eats in Denver. And the numbered blue boxes are vendors, or the setup for whether the vendors would be, and then I believe these green S's are for the zero waste stations that are placed kind of strategically throughout the kind of space that the food trucks are set up or the vendors are set up in. And here's another from, this is Columbia, Missouri, this True False Film Festival map. And so this is a larger event. And so this is kind of the zoomed out of the street view because the venue, this film festival was happening in a number of different buildings. They've identified kind of where all of the film venues are, or music venues, restaurants, etc. And they're using arrows to describe bus routes. And so just another example.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Jamie, so that map was used to discuss, because it's such a big, downtown venue that encompassed, included many different venues and restaurants that were participating, that we used that to discuss where material was going to be staged. And so this map was not the final version, but it was, a good reference so we could talk about where, certain venues were going to be sending their material, to dumpster A. And I think it's just, a different example, and it relates to like work that we've done with Boulder International Film Festival as well, which has a similar type of approach to their event.
Right. Thanks for noting that. And then this is also from Civic Center Eats. So this is their food truck lineup that they produced, this amazing organizational scheme for which vendors were appearing at the Civic Center Eats event on each day of the week that it was happening. And so they split it by kind of type of food, and then also using the columns as vectors for the days of the week that those vendors were there. And so this is made it much easier to be able to reach out to vendors in advance to ensure that the material that they were bringing was, certified compostable, or that they were, signing the vendor agreement or zero waste pledge to make sure that they were doing everything necessary to be compliant with the effort at Civic Center Eats. And so there were a number of kind of partners with Civic Center Eats. They used the building, the Civic Center Conservatory. They had a cleanup or a grounds crew, sightline events, who helped keep the grounds clean during and after the event. And they also used scraps for compost hauling. But on the right side of the screen is an example of what they produced as their zero waste pledge. And so the text is a little small, but these bullet points are things that the organizers at Civic Center Eats wanted their vendors to be compliant with. And so a few examples are for food or for drinks and desserts, we will only offer compostable straws, and then by request if possible. And then making sure that they pack out the remaining waste from their back of house, and that they won't, put mixed bags at stations or leave them on the ground or anything like that. And so this is definitely a great way to keep track of and ensure that any vendors that you have are, doing their part to contribute to zero waste at the event.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah, go for it.
Wanted to add that you're probably going to mention it, but so this is an example of how our vendor agreement can be adapted and customized to a specific event. So it definitely is based on our agreement, but Civic Center Conservancy, just did a great job in general of translating, our kind of guidance and tools into something that was very customized and branded as Civic Center Eats, and I think it was a really great execution.
And so it continues again on the right side of the screen on this slide. This is the second page of it, and a lot of these resources are from our vendor agreement for the purchasing guidelines. So we kind of reemphasize that compostable materials are food products, paper products, or the number 7 PLA or polylactic acid, and that they must be certified. We use BPI as the main institute that that has the certification for whether a product is compostable, but there also exists Cedar Grove and another called TUV Austria. And so this pledge, like Bill mentioned, was adapted from our own vendor agreement, but they did a great job of kind of making it their own. And we definitely recommend that you all at Wheat Ridge kind of design your own for any future vendors at your events. And then I also want to make a point about the environmental fee. And so at Civic Center Eats, there was an environmental fee of, I think it was 2% on all transactions at the event. And so all of the money for every transaction with a food vendor or beverage vendor, 2% would go back to Civic Center Eats. And that would help provide or cover the costs of having scraps, haul compostable material, paying sightline events for the grounds crew or for their grounds crew employees for cleanup. And so this is a great example of the kind of partnership that they had with their food vendors for kind of making it a collaborative effort. And it wasn't all just on the vendors to be compliant, that they kind of had this fee to help bring the money back to the organization and support financially the zero waste efforts. And then on-site trainings, this is another important piece for the vendor engagement. In addition to the vendor agreement, you definitely want to, on the day of the event, once vendors have set up, either provide a training or go up to vendors and ensure that the material that they have listed on the vendor agreement or the pledge is the material that they said they would bring, and then check that it is compostable, or ensure that what they're bringing is what they said they would, so that there aren't any mix-ups. Because if a vendor brings plastics utensils that they thought were compostable but they aren't, it's going to cause a really big problem for your goalies who might be assuming that all the utensils are compostable if all the other vendors are compliant. So it's really good to double check with vendors on the day of the event. And then the next couple slides are examples of environmental benefits calculator. And so this is kind of on the back end of what EcoCycle produces. Once an event is completed, we calculate by volume how much material is collected, either food waste or commingled containers, which is a single stream, and all other possible materials that are tied into the event. If you're looking to collect plastic film, then we'll include that. And this creates the diversion rate. And so that's what I mentioned earlier, is all of the material that you save from going to landfill. And so this is one example of that calculator. And then here's another.
Jamie?
Yep.
Could I intervene for a second? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
So this is the kind of legacy environmental benefits calculator that EcoCycle has used. Oh, that's the alarm. 45 minutes. I just wanted to mention that. But we've actually transitioned. This was outdated. It was using old conversion factors from a very old version of WARM, the EPA's waste kind of impact calculator, and also toxics conversion factors that were very much dated. So we actually transitioned to WARM version 15, characterization and conversion factors this year. So we're not going to be using this anymore, but in combination with WARM, there's the EPA also has the greenhouse gas equivalencies, site and formulas. And so you can use WARM in conjunction with that to kind of create meaningful metrics to communicate to your community. What does, savings in however many tons of greenhouse gases translate into, cars off the road, or in terms of, trees planted, things like that. And so that's kind of what we're moving to, because we wanted to make sure that we were keeping pace with the EPA's guidance on waste management. So
thanks for those notes. And so again, this is just another example from another Candid or Crush Your Crusade grant recipient. And true false again. And so I think, Kayla, you were sent, when you signed the grant, you were sent one of these, or something that might look similar to this. It's a Excel document or a Google Sheets that.
I have that.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so that's what you'll use for reporting, and I'll talk in a minute about calculating and those weights or volumes of material. And then this is just an example from Juneteenth. We worked with them in 2018 to launch their first zero waste effort. And so they had just kind of like a promotional kind of post about their efforts. And so this is just an example about how to celebrate and communicate zero waste efforts, either at your events citywide or with local works or something like that. And so moving to Wheat Ridge, I've got your schedule for zero waste implementation. And so as we know, next Friday, you have your first event, Movies on the Ridge. And then again, you have another in August that you'll be prepping for. But then in between that, performances in the park, I think you said is still happening, and with possibly more dates in the future. So that's exciting. And then Ridgefest in about a month and a half, and then employee pancake breakfast in December. But what we're most looking to work towards is the Movies on the Ridge for next Friday. And so this slide and the next slide are kind of the things to do, I guess, and the checklist for preparing for the event. And so I've written for supplies that flashlights, headlamps might be useful for any sort of volunteers that you get, so that it's much easier to see, the material or the stickers for any event goers who might be looking to, get rid of material on site. And then masks, obviously, I'm sure you have some sort of policy or plan in place for those. But then nitrile gloves for sorting and handling material, especially if you're dealing with people's food, then you probably want to be safe about not touching people's food and probably having them place their own materials into the bins, because you don't want to be coming into contact with any of their bodily fluids or anything like that. And so the grabbers, I'm not sure if you've bought those yet, but those will definitely come in handy for moving material that might be placed misproperly. And then equipment, you'll want to have your obviously X-frames set up next to the vendors. But then also, I know I saw your email just before this, depending on how many people come, Bill, she had a question about what is kind of the ratio of stations to event goers. And I think the generalization that we use, or there isn't like a good rule, but depending on if you have less than, I think, like 300 to 500 people come in, then probably 2 or 3 stations would be okay. I would definitely have one near the food truck, but then also either centrally located or towards the exits. But if people are driving into cars and staying in cars, then maybe on the most trafficked paths between cars and wherever the food truck is going to be set up.
Yeah, for like a non-COVID time event, I think one of the X-frame full stations is, capable of handling about 50 people, between 50 and 100, depending on your staff support. If you'll find that, like, if you have your well-trained staff volunteers, that they can do a lot with less, do more with less. And during COVID, I guess you'll just have to play it by ear and see how it goes. It's going to be an interesting experiment to see what kind of materials you get. And I think in general, what we try to do is where we know that there's the potential for contamination because people are bringing in food that we can't control. We try to preface with, if you can, take away, whatever you bring with you. But anything that is served at the event from our vendors, is compostable or it's recyclable. And so that way, you may mitigate, some potential contamination. Yeah, this is an interesting experiment.
Right. I do know that they are limiting the attendance for this second go around. So I know there's, it's an RSVP event with tickets that are, being reserved for it. So I think I was planning on having volunteers at the food vendor, since we are working with the vendor and the compostable materials, to let them know if they, and there is only one vendor. I know that came up. So it's just one food truck. So we'll just let people know that, these materials are compostable. So make sure that, you come back and return them to the station. And then I think with it being a drive-in event, we'll kind of have to feel it out, like you said, to see how many people are bringing their own food. Are they keeping it in their vehicles, or are they looking for a place to dispose of it during the event? So should be interesting.
It's great. I think it's awesome that you're doing this.
Yeah, and so on that note of material, Bill and I were chatting beforehand, and something you'll want to do, if it seems that most of the material is going to be compostable, then you'll probably just be bringing that to City Hall the day after the night of. But whether you figure out whether there's dumpsters on site, then something for the reporting's sake is you want to do kind of a check or of those dumpsters to see how much material is in there. So there might already be either contamination in the bins or some amount of material in there. And so if you're calculating the diversion rate by volume, then depending on the size of the bin, say it's a 3-yard bin, then you'll want to make a note of how much material is in those dumpsters before the event starts, so that once you toss the material into the recycling and trash after the event's done, that you can record, okay, there was about 25%, or this bin was about 25% full, and it's 3 yards, and then after the event, it was probably about 50% full. Then you can gauge and do a calculation by volume to say you filled about 25% of that 3-yard bin for either trash or recycling. But doing that check is really important so that you have a baseline for how much material you actually produced at Movies on the Ridge.
So just a quick question about that. Is it more typical to do it based off of the size of the dumpster, or like you mentioned, when I think we were looking at the diversion worksheet, where you take into account the size of the bag that you're putting into the dumpster? So if it's a 64-gallon bag, then you can assume that it's 64 gallons of waste or recycling, or is it the conversion between that and the dumpster that the challenge comes in?
Yeah, I'll interject. I think it's case by case. Different organizations have different practices. True Falls Film Festival weighed everything. Okay. And if you're working with a specific hauler, they're going to provide you with the weights when they tip the material at the processing facility. And so it depends on who you're working with and your preference. We try to make it flexible. So if you are not collecting the weights, or you're not sure if you're going to be able to get the final weights, you can take this volume measure. And I think, Jamie gave the example of the 3-yard dumpster. That's a common size of dumpster. It could be a 64-gallon toter, and that's fine. When you get to bags, it becomes a little bit more amorphous, because bags, it could be a 45-gallon bag that is, however much full with certain material. It's really hard to gauge that. When things are placed in a bin, or dumpster, it settles. And so you get a much more accurate read, because you have the volume plus, the contents, what that material is. And so that provides us just with a lot more consistency in making those volume to weight conversions, which which we want to do. So I don't know, does that kind of answer?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll try to finish quickly because we just hit the hour mark. I'm sorry if I budge into any of your times this afternoon. The next few things, we've already kind of talked about the vendor engagement component. Kayla, you've already mentioned you've got certified compostable materials, so that's great. In the future, depending on if you get more vendors at your events or whether you host larger events maybe later in this fall, you'll definitely want to make use of the vendor agreement to ensure that vendors are participating in the zero waste efforts. And if they aren't, and they come on site and have some material that is problematic, Bill and I recommend having kind of like an emergency supply kit on hand of compostable materials. So what we do for events is have a certain number of utensils, either forks, knives, spoons, all compostable, but then also like plates, bowls, and taster cups for when we're servicing large events with a lot of vendors, because it's a higher likelihood that a vendor might not have completely compliant material. And so you can either provide the material to them or charge them like the price of the material that you bought so that they are compliant at your event. And that goes into the back of house material management. So that was one of the things on the Civic Center Eats Zero Waste Pledge, is that vendors at this event were responsible for bringing their back of house materials with them when the event was completed. And they're not just leaving a bunch of, unbroken down cardboard boxes behind or containers of oil or whatever. It is really difficult when you finish an event and then the vendors leave behind a bunch of material that you weren't expecting, which is why it's really good to have it kind of clearly laid out whatever you want to do with your vendors at events. Just communicate clearly that yes, you can leave, or we will collect back of house materials, but only cardboard boxes or recyclable materials or whatever, because they can definitely add a whole lot of extra effort at the end of the event. And volunteer enlistment, depending on your strategies, we offer or recommend sometimes having incentives at events. So Upslope Brewery up in Boulder I think they give their volunteers either 1 or 2 drink tickets at their events if they volunteer. And so that always gets a high number of people to come to their brewery events or parties or whatever they are. And so different ways to incentivize your volunteers if you're not getting the numbers that you want, either getting them food vouchers or free entry or whatever, help kind of bring up the numbers if you need more support on the zero waste effort. And then I'm offering next Thursday for your other staff and volunteers for this training at the Sustainable Wheat Ridge meeting. But I'm sure you can distribute this training kind of however you want to the volunteers that you're going to get for next Friday. And then the last thing is reporting. And so we've been talking about that throughout the presentation. I think you've got a handle on that, but I will also be here to help support you or troubleshoot with any of the conversions or calculations that you need for getting your diversion rate. And then this slide is just an example from Big Sky Documentary Film Festival in Missoula. I'm not going to go through this, but these are kind of additional steps for the event day check-in or checklist, things to do and remember to do. And this is the list that we created for them. But yeah, a lot of good ideas. And then this is one of the last slides. So for reporting, Candide requires that you do the reporting for each of your events, the diversion rates can be calculated from that calculator or spreadsheet that they provided with you. I don't think it's mandatory, but I think having a number on volunteers and then also kind of multiplying that by their hours to kind of get the total amount of volunteer hours at events is a useful metric for kind of understanding the participation at a community level at your events and kind of seeing how you're doing with engaging with your community members. And then Bill, remind me, the breakdown for aluminum cans, are they requiring the separation of aluminum from other?
They're not requiring a separation. It's just because Crush It originated with the goal of launching recycling programs, and their backing is primarily coming from Ball. There's a strong interest in promoting aluminum as a circular material, that is ideally suited for recycling. So if you can make an estimate, that's helpful. It's not necessary. I think they can kind of just, based on the recycling numbers that you report, just make an estimate of their own. But if it's possible, we have broken out an estimate for aluminum cans for different events in the past.
Great. And final slide. Yep. So just as Bill mentioned, the slide here on Candide, their mission to recycle 20 million cans. I'm sure you're familiar, Kayla, with their mission, and then the grant, obviously, which you've gotten, the equipment, training, and the dough. It's a cute little summary of their organization and how they're supporting this effort. And then a little description and summary of EcoCycle's zero waste event history as well for your reading pleasures. And finally, want to say thank you from Sarah Leavitt and the rest of her team at Candide Foundation, and also myself and Bill being the training partner of this grant. So appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you. And thank you guys so much for, making the time to do this training. We really appreciate, your time. And I've had, an amazing experience working with you guys from the very start up until now. And, we'll continue the relationship in the future. But thank you so much for everything that you've done and just helping to coach us through the grant application and the award and even, the purchasing of all the supplies. You guys have just been there every step of the way. And I just really appreciate everything. So thank you so much. And great presentation.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really important to me as a resident of Wheat Ridge that we have these opportunities, given that we don't have a single waste hauler, and definitely have resource management opportunities for improvement. So thank you so much for your efforts.
You're welcome. Great. Yeah. Do you guys have any other questions or?
I have a couple of questions. April, do you have any? I don't know if you need to hop off at all. I have.
No, I don't have any questions right this second.
Okay. I was kind of making a list during your presentation. I didn't want to interrupt you. I think towards the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned a sorting guide that could be used for volunteer training. Is that something that you have to provide us or something I can find on your website?
Yes. We have on EcoCycle's website, we have a recycling and composting guide.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure both of those will be applicable to the city of Wheat Ridge.
There might be a few discrepancies, but we've got our 3 basic guides for each of the major resource streams. So single stream recycling, industrial composting, and landfill. But we also have kind of specific, more like deep dive guides. The dirty dozen for recycling that you want to keep out of recycling, and also how to compost. So there's some really good PDFs that are either in a 1-page or 2-page format that can be really helpful to kind of add to the knowledge at your organization and amongst your stakeholders.
Great. In your experience at zero waste events, are there any items or products that come up a lot that, maybe might be different or strange, or things that, will trip up volunteers that maybe we can talk about now and kind of get in this recording so that, we have the answer to that? Things like, I saw corks on there. I don't think that maybe that's too common at a zero waste event, but are there any things that are common at zero waste events that, might bring up a discussion of, is it recyclable, compostable, or landfill?
Yeah, great question. You want to start, Jamie?
Yeah, one that just came to mind is gum. Chewing gum is really common, and people go back and forth on compost or trash, but it goes in the trash. And especially if there's gonna be kids at these events, then that might be a common thing that volunteers or the goalies kind of come in contact with, where they're like, oh, it goes in your mouth, it's food, it should go in the compost, but it's a trash item.
Yeah, I think so really relying on the guides is key, and the signage. And then you can kind of complement that with an understanding that, for example, in the single stream bin, people often think if it's plastic, it's recyclable. And we're really conditioned as a culture in America to look for those recycling symbols. But the recycling symbols are resin codes for industry. They were not intended for consumers. We've just been kind of conditioned to reference those. And so people think that if something has a symbol on it, it's automatically recyclable, and it's not necessarily the case. Like, one thing that's a little different is just the size of the plastic. If it's a small piece of plastic in modern sorting systems, it's going to be a contaminant effectively. So that's why bottles, PET bottles, have to be emptied of liquid with the cap back on. So the cap is not loose. So that cap is an example of something that theoretically is recyclable, but like a fork or a knife, they're too small, assuming they're clean, to be recycled. And then the other thing is just contamination, not really being aware about what is problematic, what degree of contamination of food, for example, of liquid, is problematic in the recycling stream. Likewise in the compost stream, that a little bit of plastic is okay. No, it's not. It's just not. The compost, part of the education opportunity is to talk about the life cycle of food waste and organic waste, where it goes, where it ends up, and what it becomes, which is going to be a soil amendment, and that's being introduced to an ecosystem. And if you have metal, if you have petroleum-based plastic residue, if you have, you're going to be introducing these materials into the environment, and they can be gobbled up by critters, and or just create problems in whatever ecosystem they're being introduced to. And we're all familiar with the microplastics issue, and that's kind of one of the outcomes. I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, that's great. So people are bringing their own, so it's kind of interesting with our events coming up. So with Movies on the Ridge, it's a drive-in, so we're not sure about the amount of waste because people will be in their vehicles. Yeah. With performances in the park, they decided not to have food vendors because it's kind of late notice and things like that. And then people will be socially distanced in circles that are, laid out on the ground. So for the most part, people will be bringing their own food and their own products to this event. And I know what's on the grounds right now are just the stationary trash cans. And so, we anticipate that there will be, soda bottles and maybe cans and things like that people will bring from their home. So I think just the piece even about the top being on the soda can, so it's dumping out the liquid and then making sure the top is back on, I think could be something really useful in an event like that.
Yeah. I do think something for both events coming up and the movies will be candy wrappers. So I would assume that people would be, buying the type of candy that they would buy if they were going to the movie theater. So it may be a bag of M&Ms that is like the family size, that's harder plastic, versus the paperish type of plastic. And and then, you know, your snack bags, like your chip bags that are that film plastic.
Yeah. I think a few things. So plastic wrappers, snack bags are pretty difficult. You know, they can be sent to like a TerraCycle, but then you're shipping across the country. You know, questionable value in doing that because of the emissions that are going to result from shipping. But you know, I think you treat those as trash items in general and just try to capture whatever food residue in the compost bin. So, you know, kind of say, hey, you know, if you have any food waste, make sure it goes in the compost bin. And then your wrappers and everything else is trash. I just was, you know, triggered another thought of what might be common. Hot coffee cups, any type of coffee cups, you know, from your Starbucks or whatever. In general, I think Wheat Ridge is going to be different than Denver. Denver has access through Alpine to recycling of the hot coffee cups, which sounds great, but it's a huge problem. Those coffee cups do have a petroleum-based plastic liner, polypropylene liner. They can theoretically be recycled. If you remove the top becomes trash. Even though it has a recycling symbol on it, it's too small. There may be, you know, districts and sorting systems that can accept those lids, but in general, they're a trash item. And then the cup has to be entirely emptied of liquid. And we know that your typical coffee drinker who doesn't finish their coffee is going to throw the whole thing into the recycling bin, which is a huge problem, you know, because it introduces those liquids. So I would expect that you're going to see a lot of coffee cups. The guidance is if we can confirm that those coffee cups are going to be going to Alpine eventually, or there's a system in place to sort those cups, that they have to be emptied of liquid and the lid removed.
What about the sleeve that can be recycled because it's paper, or does it also have that weird plastic film?
So I think that those sleeves, you kind of have to do a quick, check visually. If it's just, recycled content cardboard, then I think you could compost that. You could also, technically, you could recycle it. It's a lower grade paper. It's probably gone through several cycles, and now it's a recycled paper product. So probably composting is the best. But sometimes they have a glossy coating. They have other things because people are trying to brand, you know, their beverage, and you kind of have to just judge it case by case.
Gotcha. Is it typical that sorting needs to happen at every event? So after the event or before the bag of material is thrown into the dumpster, is it typical with sorting, or is it more so just if you're having the goalie at the station, then you call it good?
I think from my experience, if your goalies and you feel confidently that they're trained on the guides and they're, you know, pretty competent about like the materials going in which stream, and that they've got a good handle on it, it's usually pretty good to toss, whether it's the recycling and you think it's like well sorted. With our staff for our events, we're all trained beforehand, and so we all kind of have that knowledge about, okay, we're at this event in this city, you know, these materials go in these bins, and so, you know, we're really confident once a bag is full that can go just like straight to the recycling dumpster. But if you have like new volunteers or people who may not be as familiar with zero waste, or even like composting is new to a lot of people, and so I think it's kind of on you and or your team to train the volunteers as much as possible, and then be there with them at the event to be able to like help them be like, oh yeah, that candy wrapper, that's going in the trash, but you know, put that whatever the Skittles into the compost if they didn't finish it or something like that.
Just to add, so if you have on-site dumpsters or roll-offs, they need to be kind of sequestered from the public and monitored by your staff, because they will become contaminated if they're anywhere near the flow of people who are participating in the event. And also after the events where we provide staffing and hauling services, we do check. So we're gonna make sure from the bins, the zero waste stations, to whatever receptacle or truck the material's getting to, that it has been checked. Oftentimes, to kind of get back to your original question, at the end of the events, the day of or after the event is completed, we're in the yard and we're quickly arranging the materials so that different trucks can take compost to the compost facility or recycling to the Boulder County Recycling Center, etc. We are doing a visual check, and so we will make sure that there are no major contaminants in any of the bins. However you do that, wherever you can kind of do that quality control, you should definitely do it. And because as a culture, we're really not accustomed to monitoring what we do with our waste. Yeah. And there's a lot of room for error, right, it's understandable.
I think we're sitting in a really unique spot right now where we have the opportunity to start with these smaller events and kind of start with different types of events with different types of structure, so that we can kind of, tackle different issues and challenges as we go before we, do something large like the Carnation Festival, hopefully next summer.
Yeah, and we have a lot of experience with some very large events, multi-day events, different venues, different types of food and beverage service. So a lot of different considerations. So please, use us as a resource so that we can help you succeed.
Definitely. Yeah, the presentation gave me a lot to think about as far as the Carnation Festival for next year and the planning and, mapping and coordination that, I think will work as a committee to kind of work towards that.
Cool.
Those are all my questions. April, do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you.